Let's talk about color and light, especially as it relates to digital painting and illustration, and the way that you can really enhance your work. So let me share my samples and we'll talk about it. So when you're thinking about the essential elements of painting, color and light is everything. And it really is what sets good art apart from amazing art, is the artist's ability to play with color and light. Great example of this for me is James Gurney, illustrator extraordinaire. Here's a picture of him in his studio. He's most well known for working on Dinotopia. And Dinotopia is a cool children's book series with amazing, beautiful illustration. And what sets it apart is its realism, but then also his amazing painting ability. And he has a book about color and light, in addition to the Dinotopia series, where he talks about painting techniques. And so a lot of this stuff you might think as you're learning to make art, maybe it's intuitive or whatever, but there's a lot of really good, clear advice that he gives in his book that I want to talk about because it's not a mystery. There are techniques and things that you can do today to improve your work. So let's talk about some. First is a clear understanding that color comes from light. Now, scientifically, we can talk about that. Actually, we can't talk about that because I don't understand the science. But basically, every light source contains all the potential light waves that are visible to the human eye. And you can prove that by refracting light through a prism, and you get that spectrum, you get that rainbow spectrum. And that is how light is reflected off the surface of an object and back into our eyes. And of course, this is a scientific thing where the narrow band that the human eye can see, of visible light, is how we experience the world around us. So the artist's job isn't necessarily to understand the science, but to understand how it works. And if you understand how it works, you can recreate it or manipulate it in an effective way. So a typical thing that we do is we paint these color wheels to analyze the different color mixing strategies and figure out how to create the value, the tint, and the shade or the chroma of the color that we use to balance out that color harmony. And then we study how color works with color and the relationships between one color and another on the color wheel. And we understand that when we harmonize our color and we coordinate that color using those scientific rules and techniques, our artwork looks better. So it's important to have a fundamental understanding of the color theory that relates to complementary color, analogous color, and so on, so that you can coordinate your color in the best way. Uh-oh. This is the other thing to understand about color. Not only is there a scientific, technical uh, you know, uh, process for color. It's also subjective. So sometimes you can pick a color scheme, but then how people perceive it is totally different. I am convinced that certain people were messing with me because they kept saying this was gold and brown. No, it was a blue dress. I promise you. All right, the next little thing to pay attention to is what we call warm versus cool color, or warm light and cool light. And for me, it's a way to enhance contrast. As you take a look at this painting, it very clearly has a cool side and a warm side. Those cool colors, the purples, blues, that range, and then the oranges and yellows and bright white gets into that warm side, that reddish hue. Now, what does that do? More than anything, it just creates contrast so that you can see the difference between a background and a foreground, or natural light and electric light. So that's reflected in this painting. So it isn't to say that we always do this or that. It's just to say that if you want to create a contrast and make certain things very visible, you have to pick one or the other or put them against each other so that they become more obvious. Here's an example from Gurney, where he has a warm backlight coming from the sun, almost like sunrise. And then in the foreground, you have cool colors that are on the far side that aren't actually being exposed to that light. And so they sit in that cool shadow area. What that really does, as you look at this picture, is create contrast. So you can see the dinosaur and the characters in the foreground, and you just see a distinction between the shadow area and the bright light area. So it's that contrast that makes things work. So look for that balance in your artwork. Here's the reverse. Here we have a cool kind of pale background color from the natural light, and then we have the warm illuminated light inside this covered space. And so that contrast again of the dinosaurs in the foreground, the dinosaurs in the background, you can see the difference between them because the shadows are warm and the bright light is cool. So this is just to say that you can flip it and that you can reverse it. It doesn't really matter. What matters is the picture you're trying to create, and by using contrast, you're making things stand out and more visible. Another important thing to do is to think of color in families or to make groups of color, essentially to limit your color. So as he talks about it, he talks about like gamut masking, which is kind of a technical term, where you take, the color wheel and then you narrow the band of color that you're going to use for the different segments of your painting. And the reason you do that is to create that sense of space, and it makes that picture more unified. So if you narrow the band of color and you don't just use any color on the color wheel, but you actually narrow it down, you can start to unify your artwork in a way that is unique and interesting. It's like a color tint. You see this in movies a lot where they'll take, Matrix is probably the most obvious, where you look at it and it has that green tint. Well, that unifies everything and makes it feel more cohesive. So it's an artistic choice. Another thing to understand about color is that there is a difference between the color of an object and the way it appears, depending on how the light is interacting with that object. So a lot of times people have maybe a fundamental understanding of, oh, okay, this ball is red. But actually, at night in moonlight, it doesn't look like bright red, does it? It's different. So that's a change. And that's something that you have to think about when you're selecting your color. This picture is a great representation of, how different light changes the way that dinosaur looks. This is another great example. When you think about this, the buildings are built out of sandstone, let's say. Let's just say they're sandstone buildings. And so that means the blocks are made out of the same material. So in reality, those blocks are the same color, whether they're in the background building or in the foreground building. But because of the different light sources, those objects absorb a different color. And so playing with that is how you build that atmosphere and that space and that perspective. And so here you have that cool light in the background, making that gray stone look coolish and greenish, whereas the warm light in the foreground makes it look purplish and reddish. So objects absorb the color around them, and pay attention to that. And the best way to see that is to observe reality, to just look at what's happening in the world around us. Reflected and ambient light is another thing that is really cool and helps create even more contrast in your work. I love these little plein air paintings that Gurney does. He has his little sketchbook and he shares these pictures on his blog. Well, this is one, just a typical, sunny day. The sun is rising in a snowfield next to a house, and you just see very indistinct little brushstrokes, but you can picture what's happening. And the beautiful part to me is that narrow little band of yellowish white bright edges on the edge of that snow bank. And it looks cool and it just stands out. And that only works, or it looks, I think, more beautiful because it's right next to that low blue gray color in the side. And you just I can feel the temperature of this picture. It feels cold. I've experienced this kind of a setting, so it looks cool. Here's another great example. This one is from like Mead Schaefer and N.C. Wyeth. Look at how they use color to depict nighttime. So you would think, oh, it's nighttime, it's just black and dark. Maybe. So you might get some dark, rich shadow areas, which you can see, but then all the intermediate area is actually a grayish, bluish, purplish tone. And it's beautiful how they can paint a dark night while still showing distinct objects, and it's not just a black, hidden surface. But by coordinating that blue, cool tone, it can really create a dynamic scene. Plus, look at the cool little moonlight that shows up on the brick and the cobblestone. Really interesting. So, color is really useful when trying to create atmosphere and scene. So, pay attention to how it works in the shadow and the highlight. Here's some more of that reflected light. I love how just in this basic watercolor painting, you've got, these different surface textures. You've got the skull and you've got glass and you've got a surface. And then there's like a little bit of green, but that green also is reflected up onto the surface of the skull. Same with the purpley blue shadow on the side of the skull's face. And then there are these little specular highlights on the glass, these little bright white spots that tell you, oh, this is super polished and reflective. And so you can see it. So those little white dots, those little white areas are what really sell the contrast and the texture of an object. So pay attention to how color is absorbed by the objects around it or reflected on its surface from other surfaces, and then also how that reflective surface is bright with white and shiny edges. Value is king. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that at its core, your picture is either strong or weak based on how good and distinct the value is in that picture. So, great example. If you look at these rough sketches, they're just black and white with a very faint gray tone. Well, all the information you need to see is reflected there in those little images, and it's very purely black and white. If the strength of your pose, your character, your scene can work in black and white in stark contrast, then you know that when you fill in color, it's going to be a settled and beautiful piece. But if you can't resolve what's happening in the picture in just grayscale or gray tone or black and white, then that picture is going to fall apart. I think a good example of this too might be old movies. If you look at old movies, they didn't have the benefit of color to create contrast. So they had to work very, very hard to use value to create that contrast. And so they paid attention to shadows and they paid attention to shapes and background elements that framed the character, framed the actor, and made the scene. And they had to do that. Otherwise, the picture would appear too flat or it'd be too hard to understand what was happening in that purely grayscale black and white world. So today, though, I think that maybe movies, painters, illustrators, when we're using color, we forget how important that value is to creating that stark relief. And so pay attention to that. And I personally recommend working in black and white first. Whether I'm working on a logo or I'm working on an illustration, I like using black and white to resolve the shapes, the silhouettes, the line art first, and then the color kind of falls into place like a puzzle. So if you mix it together and you try to do it all at once, try to figure out the value and the color at the same time, for me, it always gets confused and it doesn't work. Here's another cool example of painting in shadow, where using color and the contrast between the bright and the light, and then the shadow side really creates the impression that you're in shadow, even though it's a bright, warm brown painting. Atmospheric perspective, say that 3 times fast, is something that you should understand and how it also changes the way color appears. This is really important when painting environments and to try to create that distance and perspective. I love Gurney's painting here of this little ordinary town, but then the bright, warm light contrasted with very, very faint um, blue and gray on the windshields or some other little concrete areas of the picture. It just feels a little bit overexposed or like there's a haze over the scene. It's just cool. I dig it. Really nice. Here's some other examples. Using, a dominant color, like in the violet and purple side or in the blue cool side, you can see how using that, you can create that atmosphere by changing the value of that color, how it pushes things into the background or brings things forward into the foreground. The darkest areas are closest to us. The lightest areas are furthest away. Um, we observe this in real life when we go to a place like the Grand Canyon, right? Where you can see off in the distance, we know, intellectually that the rock is the same color, whether it's in front of us or far away from us. But because of the the color, frankly, of the air, the atmosphere, it shifts and fades and makes more pale that color in the background. So the more you observe that, the more you put that into your pictures, the more you can control perspective or the optical illusion of perspective in your paintings. Because what you're trying to do is make something that is flat, a 2D surface, appear like it has distance. Color mixing. All right, so this is a a technique for making the art you're going to make, whether you're working in vector art or you're working on a digital painting. Color mixing is where you want to limit your color. So this is using pigment, but the same is true digitally, where if you pick in this case 4 dominant colors, look at all the variations you can make out of just those 4 dominant colors. And so essentially it's a triad where you've got, that dark bluish gray, the medium gold, the red, the white, and mixing them together, you get a range of color. What does that do for you, really? What it does is it unifies that picture again. It makes it look like it fits in the same scene. It's part of the same story. You can use this to actually control the color of your story, whether you're trying to paint, an angry scene, so things tilt toward the warm colors, or a cool, peaceful scene, and you tilt things toward the cool blue colors. I don't know if I said that right. Warm reddish, blue cool. Anyways, I think you get the idea. And by limiting your color, you keep a range and you break it down into these accents that really stand out and are in high contrast with one another. Painting spectral effects and lighting is something that really creates, that fantasy element you're looking for. This is kind of fun. If you look at this picture, how you have fairly ordinary color in the background and in the foreground, kind of a cheery scene with the flowers and the plants and the trees, and kind of a faded sunset in the background. But then because of the high contrast between that golden yellow color of the lighting and the cool pale colors in the background, it really makes it stand out like it's an illuminated area. Like these are some electronic or, you know, um, firelights inside these buildings. They really stand out as a result. And you only see that because of the contrast between the warm and the cool. But to create that special effects, you have to really turn it up. Really have to make that contrast more extreme to make it really stand out and look otherworldly. For example, in this case, we have some unexpected colors uh, illuminating the area, which is what makes it look otherworldly. It doesn't look natural, but it looks pretty because it's a good balance of, uh, you know, uh, coordinated, complementary color is the word I was looking for, right? So you got that blue turquoise in the base, that purplish yellowish in the top, and then that narrow band of a bright light in the middle illuminating the space. And then, of course, you have little characters in the foreground that tell you how large the space is. And so, if you want to create an otherworldly feel, you really have to create a heightened contrast. Turn up that color contrast to 11. Observe, don't memorize. And so this is Gurney's advice that, you know, you can certainly try to master and memorize what's happening, but the best way to get good color is to observe what you see and interpret what you see. And so, with that knowledge of how color works and how light works, you can then paint the picture in the best way possible by interpreting it with your choices for those colors. And as long as you understand the relationships, you can mimic reality and make it a little bit different. And so, this is a great example. I love seeing this shift from that light, bright, warm color scheme as it fades into the atmosphere. Love it. Same with something like this, just an ordinary town scene, but he brings it to life with the way he balances that warm and cool color and selects that narrow band of color to make it feel like it's part of the same scene. So, if you have an interest in this and you want to improve and increase what you can do with your artwork, try to master some of these tips and apply them in your artwork. And if you ever think that maybe your work isn't quite there, try picking one of these, whether it's increasing the contrast, looking for specular highlights, adding a little bit of contrast in the ranges of colors, whatever it may be. Try some of these and see how it goes. All right. So good luck with that. I hope that you have, um, there we go. I hope you have some success with your artwork. For me, it's a lifetime pursuit, learning how to paint and draw. But using color with a few of these tips has really improved my work, whether it's been doing logo design or illustration. It's just first and foremost limiting that color, understanding what works in contrast with each other, and staying within that area, and you'll find success. All right. So hopefully that helps. Have fun.